So the poet then used the huge number of tree leaves to illustrate the huge number of spiritual truths that can exist. A second way that trees and spirituality are related is through breathing. The Hebrew word for breath is neshima, and the same root word for the soul, which is neshama. So spiritual life, this tells us spiritual life is very close metaphorically to air and respiration. And when we think about what trees do, heavens, one of the main things they do for themselves is photosynthesize. They take in carbon dioxide, which we are breathing out, and they change that biochemically into oxygen, which we breathe in. When we think about breathing, in the art of meditation, if any of you take yoga, you're constantly being reminded by the yoga practitioner to breathe in and breathe out, to pay attention to this breath, to focus, to empty the mind, and to notice the in and the out. Trees and silence are another connection, another spiritual connection that we have with trees. Buddhists have a special word and meaning for silence, samatha. And that is like the spiritual cultivation that's concerned with the calming of the mind. When the mind is capable of stillness and is put into a suitable framework, then inspiration and wisdom can arise. And recall that the word calming was part of that definition of spirituality of the Dalai Lama. The practice to achieve this stillness, this samatha, is by focusing on something static, something that does not move. And I can't think of anything that doesn't move as much as trees, since they are rooted in the ground and are there as a powerful sort of evocation of the importance of stillness in our lives. Wendell Berry wrote a short poem called I Go Among the Trees and Sit Still that I think really illustrates this idea. I go among the trees and sit still. All my stirrings become quiet. Around me, like circles on water, what I fear in it leaves it, and the fear of it leaves me. It sings, and I hear its silent song. I know for me, when I've attended services in one church or another, or when I'm out in the forest, some of the most powerful moments are silence. The silence that we experienced between the hymn and the welcoming. The silence in certain phrases that Reverend Goldsmith says when he stops for a moment and lets us have that moment of stillness to give more emphasis. So when trees remind us of stillness, as they do to me, it gives more power to the words and the thoughts that we express. Another precept in terms of trees and spirituality is trees and oneness. The idea that in Buddhist thinking, we have the idea of having some sort of separate entity from others. But in fact, Buddhists believe that there is no external individual being apart from the interaction with others. And I know, as a forest ecologist, and what I teach my students, is this concept of modern ecological studies of food webs, of ecosystem ecology, of global ecology, that we are all interconnected. There is no place one can go. There is no single action one can take that doesn't affect another. The fossil fuels that we burn in our SUVs has everything to do with the slowly rising sea levels that people living on a Pacific atoll are experiencing. My own research in the Pacific Northwest, climbing trees, big leaf maple trees, and my studies of the licorice fern, Polypodium glycyrrhiza, which grows abundantly, beautifully on these tree branches. You see these individual fronds sort of up on different branches. Well, when I trace an individual frond, I find that it ends up in this sort of nubbly, licorice-tasting root. And if I follow that root down, I see that it has put out another frond, which is connected to that same root. If I continue to follow that root, I find that all of these fern fronds throughout the whole tree, which look like individual plants, are in fact all linked through the same root. They're all the same genetic material. They are what the Buddhists have told us about in terms of trees and humans, that we are all interconnected. The next thing I'd like to speak about is trees and time. I think trees help humans tell time. They spell the seasons. And for me, anyway, there is nothing that more effectively indicates the passing of the seasons than looking at the colors of our beautiful yellow aspen trees out on the hillsides behind us here, of the beautiful greeny buds that pop out in the springtime that E.E. Cummings described in his poet, and the white lacy twiglets that we see covered with snow when snow hits the mountains here. But at a longer time scale, I think trees teach us about time as well. Trees teach us that all of living things are dynamic in nature. They remind us that we have to accept change even if it seems destructive. So when I go out to my research plots in Costa Rica and I see tree number 253 that has fallen down in the interim period, my first sense is of sadness or disaster, because I've climbed that tree, I've sampled it, I've numbered it, I've named it, I've included it in my scientific papers. But what I have to do is stop and realize that that dynamicism is part of what the forest is about. And in fact, I should celebrate that tree's death, because the light gap that ensues allows the new generation of seedlings to grow. The last thing I'll talk about is trees and hidden worlds. And this, I think, is something a bit more subtle. But we all know that trees manifest hidden spheres. Their roots are underground and out of sight. And yet, they provide the tree with all of the water and nutrient gathering apparatus that that tree needs. So tree roots also symbolize, to me anyway, that which we keep hidden from ourselves and from others. Our troubles, our failings, our addictions, our ill health, and our fears. But to be truthful, to be full of trough like a tree, we must recognize those negative or underground parts of ourselves. Like a tree roots, these hidden parts are an important part of us, not something to discount. And we also know that revealing these hidden parts, unearthing these root part of ourselves to our spouses, to our friends, to our clergymen, most of all to ourselves actually, this is the first step in finding strength to overcome them. David Wagner has a wonderful poem called Lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and bushes beside you are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. The forest breathes, it answers, I have made this place for you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. We can recognize that many of these spiritual values and many other values of trees, ecological, economic, aesthetic, and recreational, have stirred humans to protect trees. But I just want to point out a few instances where spiritual values have already been used to inculcate a sense of conservation. When we think about, I think, the most wonderful holiday, that religious holiday that exists, that the Jews celebrate, it's called Tu B'Shavat. It's the New Year for the trees. And it began as a secular holiday, as sort of an accounting of how much fruit a given tree provides in order for taxes to be assessed. But now it has evolved into a wonderful holiday that celebrates the gifts that trees give us. And in fact, people have a special Seder or ceremonial meal where they eat different kinds of fruit. They give money to plant trees in their own neighborhood and in Israel. And so the spiritual connection of trees to humans has been very much celebrated in this holiday. I also want to mention that, as many of you know, that there's now a very strong thread being integrated across environmentalism and evangelical Christians. They may seem like odd couples, but in fact, this belief of environmentalism, that we need to do some things to save our planet, and the ideas of evangelical Christians and other people that, in fact, God created trees and other natural objects, and we need to preserve those for the sake of God's creation, have come together. For example, in February of 2006, 86 evangelical leaders signed a statement, the Evangelical Climate Initiative. We have locally and nationally the Interfaith Power and Light group, which brings interfaith churches together to work against climate change effects. So all of this pulls me together to think about a poem by the Arabic poet Rumi called Every Tree. Every tree, every growing thing as it grows says this truth. You harvest what you sow. With life as short as a half-taken breath, don't plant anything but love. And that, I think, brings us back around to the circle of what the Dalai Lama said spirituality is about: the essence, contentment, caring, sharing, calming, and connection. And with that, I'd like to come back to your vision of your tree or your patch of forest, to think back about what that meant to you, and invite you to think about the fact that that tree that you have in your mind is all trees. And all trees, in fact, are part of all nature. The water that evaporates from our Great Salt Lake and rests for some time as snow on our Wasatch Mountains, and then flows through our 7 canyons to water the trees right here on the grounds of your beautiful Unitarian Church. All of these are interconnected. By connecting with a single tree and becoming aware of the spirituality within that tree, within ourselves, perhaps we can move through this beautiful world and this troubled world with a greater sense of mindfulness. Humans have a special affinity for trees. My hope is that you will take your image of that tree and these spiritual values and put them together when you see any tree or forest. That you will stop, you will breathe in and out, and know that you are touching something that is full of truth, full of troth, something with a strong trunk, something with deep roots, something that sweeps the sky.